Back in my day, when America was still growing into itself and communities were built on handshakes rather than contracts, there lived folks whose stories never made it into the town newspapers. These were the quiet ones, hard-working people who built our nation with their bare hands, but whose names were forgotten before the sawdust settled on their workbenches. This here tale takes place in the autumn of 1884, during the great lumber boom that was transforming our western territories. It's about a young woman whose gentle spirit would soon collide with forces that threatened to destroy not just individual lives, but entire communities built on honest labor and Christian values. Now, I reckon this story speaks to anyone who's ever felt overlooked or undervalued in this world. It reminds us that true strength doesn't come from dramatic gestures, but from quiet courage, the kind that shows itself when nobody's watching, when doing right matters more than personal safety. Sometimes, the most profound changes begin with the simplest act of human kindness, just like our Lord taught us. The coal oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the lumberyard as Mara's work-worn fingers moved with practiced care over the pine planks. Each piece received her careful attention, the grain examined for flaws, the length measured true, the quality assessed with eyes that had learned to see what others missed. At 22, she possessed a rare gift for evaluating timber that some men twice her age had never mastered. Yet come tomorrow's auction, she'd once again be treated like livestock to be sold to the highest bidder. 47 prime pine boards, 16 feet, she whispered to herself, making tiny chalk marks on the slate she kept tucked in her apron pocket. The numbers came as natural as breathing when you lived by counting every morsel of food, every penny earned. Every day until the next auction, arithmetic became a matter of survival. The morning mist clung to the Sierra Nevada foothills like a soft blanket, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, that lonesome sound that spoke of progress coming to Cedar Falls. California, but progress, as Mara had learned through hard experience, often came at the expense of folks like her. She straightened slowly, pressing her hand against the small of her back where hours of bending had created a persistent ache. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled her nostrils, mixed with the earthy smell of morning dew on sawdust. The lumber inventory would take another hour to complete, but she worked best in these peaceful moments before dawn. When the yard belonged to her alone, no harsh voices commanding her to move faster, no calculating eyes following her every movement like she was merchandise being appraised. A low groan drifted through the still air, a sound that seemed to come from near the lumber mill's main building. Mara set down her chalk, every muscle suddenly alert. The mill workers wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. And old Pete Robbins, the night watchman, usually spent his shifts dozing behind the office stove with his coffee growing cold. The groan came again, weaker this time, followed by what sounded like timber splintering. Fear and curiosity wrestled in her chest as she picked up her lamp and moved toward the sound. Her worn boots made no noise on the packed earth, a skill learned from years of making herself invisible when angry employers sought someone to blame for their troubles. The lamp's golden circle of light revealed the source of the sound, and Mara's breath caught in her throat like a prayer half-spoken. A man lay pinned beneath a collapsed wooden scaffold, his face pale as fresh snow in the flickering light. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, and his breathing, came in short, labored gasps that reminded her of her pa's final hours. But that wasn't what made her heart race like a frightened bird. The scaffold timbers that had trapped him bore the fresh marks of saw cuts, deliberate, calculated cuts that had nothing to do with the accident and everything to do with cold-blooded murder. Someone had tried to kill this stranger, and from the looks of those precisely placed cuts, they had done it with the calculating patience of a man planning an execution. Mara knelt beside the injured fellow, her mind already sorting through what she knew of emergency care from tending sick animals and helping with the difficult births. But as her lamp illuminated his features more clearly, she noticed something that made her hands tremble like autumn leaves. His clothes, though now torn and bloodied, were made of fine wool and cotton, far finer than any mill worker could afford. His hands, visible beneath the timber that trapped his arm, bore calluses that spoke of honest work. But his fingernails were clean and well kept. Most telling of all was the leather satchel that had spilled open beside him, revealing papers covered in neat handwriting and what appeared to be detailed drawings of the very lumber mill that towered above them in the pre-dawn darkness. This was no ordinary lumberjack who had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. This was someone who had been specifically targeted, and whoever had tried to kill him had chosen this remote corner of the lumberyard because they believed no soul would find the body until it was too late. They hadn't counted on Mara's habit of working before the rooster crowed. They hadn't counted on her invisible presence becoming, in this moment, the difference between life and death. The man's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with obvious effort. When he spoke, his voice carried refinement she couldn't quite place. Educated, cultured. Nothing like the rough speech of the mill workers. "Please," he whispered, and there was something in that single word that told her this man was accustomed to being heard, accustomed to having his requests granted with respect. Don't let them know you found me." But before she could ask who them might be, his eyes rolled back and consciousness left him like a departing spirit. Mara stared down at the unconscious stranger, her mind churning with possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. She had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a workplace accident. Someone in Cedar Falls was willing to commit murder, and they had chosen the lumberyard, her world, as their killing ground. The sensible thing would be to run, to pretend she had never seen him, to let the good Lord's will take its course. But as she looked at his peaceful face in the lamplight, she realized that 18 years of being treated as invisible had taught her something valuable about the nature of Christian duty. Sometimes, the most important actions were the ones no earthly soul ever witnessed, the kind that mattered most to the Almighty. She began working to free him from the heavy timber, knowing that whatever came next, her life in Cedar Falls would never be the same. The mystery of who had tried to kill this man would soon become her burden to bear. The danger that had found him would soon find her as well. And the secrets he carried would soon transform not just her own fate, but the fate of every God-fearing person in their small mountain community. As she struggled to move the heavy beam that pinned him, Mara couldn't know that she was about to save the life of a man whose true identity would shake the very foundations of everything she believed about power, justice, and her own worth in the eyes of the Lord. She only knew that someone needed help, and for the first time in her life, she was the only one who could provide it. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The timber pinning his left arm weighed more than Mara had reckoned. She wedged her shoulder against the beam, her boots sliding on the dew-slick ground as she strained to lift it. The wood groaned, but barely shifted. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the morning chill, and the familiar scent of pine sap filled her nostrils. His breathing had grown shallower. Each exhale came with a soft whistle that reminded her of the sound her grandmother made during her final illness, a memory that made her stomach clench with urgency. She repositioned herself, using a shorter piece of lumber as a lever. The physics were simple, something old Pete Robbins had shown her when moving heavy loads around the yard. The beam rose 6 inches, enough for her to drag the man's arm free. His sleeve was torn, revealing a forearm marked with fresh bruises, but no obvious break. Blood continued to seep from the head wound, dark and thick in the lamplight. She tore a strip from her cotton petticoat, the fabric giving way with a sharp ripping sound that seemed too loud in the silent yard. The cloth came away crimson when she pressed it to his forehead, and she could smell the metallic scent of fresh blood mixed with sawdust. "Can you hear me?" she whispered. No response. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that reminded her of the stillborn calf she had helped deliver last spring at the Morrison farm, a sight that still haunted her dreams. She needed to move him. The lumber office had a small, pot-bellied stove and a cot where Pete sometimes rested between his rounds, but the stranger was easily twice her weight, and dead weight at that. Mara hooked her arms under his shoulders and began to pull. Her boots found purchase on a dry patch of earth. 5 feet, 10. His boots carved twin furrows in the dirt behind them, and the smell of disturbed earth rose around them. By the time she reached the office steps, her lungs burned and her arms shook with exhaustion. The office door was locked. She felt along the frame until her fingers found Pete's spare key, hidden in a crack in the wood where everyone in Cedar Falls knew to look for it. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco and old coffee. She lit the office lamp with shaking hands and dragged the man to Pete's cot. His head lolled to one side as she arranged his limbs, and she noticed something that made her freeze like a deer hearing the hunter's step. His neck bore a thin red mark, barely visible in the lamplight, a mark that looked suspiciously like rope burn. Someone had tried to strangle him before the scaffold accident. She was still staring at his neck when footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Heavy boots, deliberate, moving toward the office with the careful rhythm of men trying not to be heard. Who else would be at the lumberyard this early? And why were they trying so hard to walk quietly? Mara blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the office, leaving only the red glow from the dying embers in the pot-bellied stove. She pressed her back against the wall beside the window and peered through a gap in the faded curtain. A figure moved between the lumber stacks, carrying a lantern that cast a weak circle of yellow light. The man wore a dark coat and moved with the careful steps of someone searching for something specific. Or someone. The unconscious stranger stirred on the cot, a low moan escaping his lips. Mara's hand flew to cover his mouth, her palm against his whiskers. His skin felt fever hot, and she could smell the sweat that had begun to bead on his forehead. The searcher stopped, listened, then continued toward the office. She needed the stranger quiet. Her fingers found the small brown bottle of laudanum in Pete's desk drawer. The old man kept it for his rheumatism. 3 drops on her fingertip, which she rubbed against the injured man's gums. His breathing deepened, the tension leaving his face as the medicine took hold. The footsteps reached the office steps. A board creaked under weight, and she could hear leather boots shifting on weathered wood. The door handle turned with a soft metallic click. Mara had forgotten to lock it behind her. The door swung open with a familiar squeak of hinges, and lantern light spilled across the floor like spilled honey. She held her breath, pressed flat against the wall, where shadows were deepest. "Pete, you in here." She recognized the voice, Jeremiah Garrett, the lumber mill foreman. But what was he doing here 2 hours before his shift? Moving around like he had something to hide. Garrett stepped inside, his lantern raised. The light swept across Pete's cluttered desk, the cold stove, the empty chairs arranged around the checkerboard. It paused on the cot where the stranger lay motionless under Pete's old woolen blanket. "Well, I'll be," Garrett muttered under his breath. "Pete's got company." He moved closer, and she could smell the tobacco on his clothes mixed with something else whiskey. Though it was barely past dawn, she could hear the leather of his boots creaking with each step, the soft whisper of his coat against his legs. If he pulled back that blanket, if he saw the stranger's torn clothes and bloodied face, if he noticed the rope burn on his neck, Garrett reached for the blanket with one weathered hand. A voice called from outside. "Jer, you find anything worth troubling about?" Garrett's hand stopped midway to the blanket. "Just old Pete sleeping off his night watch. Nothing here that can't wait for daylight. Boss wants us back at the main office. Says to leave it be for now. Coming along." Garrett lowered the lantern and headed for the door, but he paused at the threshold. His head tilted like a man listening to something only he could hear. The silence stretched until Mara could feel her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Mara waited until the footsteps faded and the lantern light disappeared into the gray pre-dawn before she dared to move. Her legs trembled as she made her way to the cot. The stranger's eyes were open, watching her with an alertness that said the laudanum hadn't fully taken hold. "They were looking for you, you idiot," she whispered. He tried to sit up. She pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart through the torn fabric of his shirt. "Stay still. You've lost considerable blood. How long was I unconscious? Maybe an hour?" "The sun's coming up soon." He closed his eyes, and she thought he might slip away again. But when he opened them, there was something harder in his gaze, the look of a man who'd made a decision. "What's your name?" "Miss Mara." "Mara." He tested the word like he was memorizing it. "I'm Caleb Stone." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it suggested it should. Like a man accustomed to having his name recognized and respected. "Who were those men?" "Mr. Stone. Men who reckon I'm dead." His voice was getting stronger, though he still hadn't tried to sit up. "Men who need me to stay dead if their plans are going to work." "What plans?" Instead of answering directly, He reached inside his torn jacket and withdrew a folded paper with shaking hands. The movement caused him to wince. "Can you read, miss?" The question stung like a slap, but she pushed the feeling aside. Some words. She unfolded the paper carefully. It was covered in neat handwriting and official-looking stamps. Most of the words were beyond her limited reading skills, but she could make out enough to understand it was some kind of legal document. And at the bottom, a signature that made her blood run cold as Winter Creek water. Jeremiah Garrett. "Your foreman," Caleb said, watching her face closely, "has been selling lumber mill properties to the Sacramento Valley Syndicate. Properties that don't rightfully belong to him. Properties that belong to the workers who built them with their own sweat and labor." The paper crinkled in her suddenly shaking hands. If this was true, if Garrett was stealing the mill from the very men who had worked themselves half to death to make it profitable, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Caleb said, and his gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter strangely. "You're the only person in Cedar Falls who's invisible enough to help me prove it." Outside, she heard the mill whistle blow its morning call, summoning the workers to their daily labor. In an hour, the lumberyard would be full of honest men who had no idea their livelihoods were being stolen from under their very feet. But first, she needed to understand exactly who Caleb Stone really was, and why someone had tried so desperately to kill him. The bigger question, one that made her hands tremble as she folded the document, was whether helping him would save the mill workers or destroy them all. Because if Jeremiah Garrett really was selling out his own men, then the danger that had found Caleb Stone was about to find every soul in Cedar Falls who dared to stand in the way of easy profit. The mill whistle's echo faded as Mar helped Caleb sit upright on Pete's cot. His face went white as fresh milk with the effort. Sweat beading on his forehead, despite the morning chill that seeped through the office walls. She wedged Pete's old feather pillow behind his back and watched his breathing steady to something more natural. "I need to get back to my work," she said. "Garrett will notice if the inventory isn't finished a morning shift." "The inventory," Caleb's voice was stronger now, though he kept one hand pressed to his ribs like they pained him considerable. "How do you organize it all?" The question surprised her. Most men assumed women couldn't count past their fingers and toes. "By grade and length. Prime boards separate from second quality, 16-foot lengths in the north stack, 12-foot in the south. Do you keep written records?" Mara hesitated. The truth would sound foolish. A woman who could barely read keeping detailed records in her head, like some kind of circus performer. "I remember the numbers, all of them. Yesterday we had 237 prime 16-foot pine boards, 18 with minor knots that Garrett calls second quality, but could sell for prime price easy enough. 42 cedar shingles with splits that need bundling separate from the good ones." Caleb stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You remember all the lumber in the entire yard." Heat crept up her neck like spilled coffee. "It's not that much to remember when you think about it proper. It's remarkable." He struggled to lean forward, wincing at the movement. "Mara, do you know what the mill pays for raw timber from the local cutters?" She shook her head. "Workers weren't told such things. Numbers were for men who wore clean shirts and kept their fingernails trimmed. $2 per thousand board feet from the local cutters. But I've seen invoices where they claim to pay $4 per thousand. Someone's pocketing the difference every single time. The numbers made her stomach tighten like a fist. $2 was what she earned in a full month of dawn to dusk work. That's stealing, plain and simple. It's fraud on a grand scale. And if Garrett's selling mill properties without proper ownership, it's also forgery of federal documents. His gray eyes met hers across the small room. I need to see those invoices with my own eyes. But I can't move around freely. Not with Garrett's men looking for me. The sound of boots on gravel made them both freeze like rabbits hearing the hounds bay. Multiple sets this time, moving with the steady rhythm of workers heading to their morning shifts. Mara moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtain. Tom Bradley and his crew were walking toward the mill entrance, lunch pails swinging in their hands, talking in the low voices men used when discussing things that troubled them. Normal morning routine. Nothing to worry a soul about. When she turned back, Caleb was studying her with an expression that made her look away quick. "You saved my life," he said quietly. And there was a weight in those words that pressed down on her shoulders. Anyone would have done the same Christian thing? No. Anyone would have run for help and let others take charge. You stayed. You thought before you acted. You protected me from Garrett's men when they came looking. His voice carried a seriousness that made her hands fidget with her apron strings. Why did you do all that? The question hung between them like morning mist. Why had she risked her own safety for a stranger? Why had she lied to Garrett by keeping silent? Why was she sitting here now, discussing mill business that was none of her concern? I don't rightly know, she said finally. And it was the honest truth. Caleb reached for something in his jacket pocket and winced at the movement. When his hand emerged, it held a small leather-bound notebook and a pencil stub worn down to barely 2 inches. Can you write numbers as well as you remember them? Some. My letters ain't fancy, but numbers come easier. I want you to record everything you remember about the lumber inventory. Every board, every grade, every length. Can you do that for me? Mara took the notebook. The leather was soft and expensive under her fingertips, not like anything she had ever owned. The pages were cream-colored and smooth as silk. What will you do with such a record? Compare it to the official mill ledgers. See where the numbers don't match up proper. He leaned back against the pillow, exhaustion evident in the way his shoulders sagged. If Garrett's been skimming lumber for side sales, your inventory will show the discrepancies clear as daylight. She opened the notebook to the first blank page. Her handwriting was crude letters learned by copying signs and labels around town, but the numbers were clear and precise. Prime pine, 16 feet, 237 boards. Second quality pine, 16 feet, 180 boards, sellable as prime pine. 12 feet, 189 boards. As she wrote, Caleb watched her hands move across the page with obvious interest. Where did you learn to write like that? Copying words from old newspapers, signs around town. The mill office has a Webster's dictionary that Pete lets me look at sometimes. You taught yourself to read and write? The admiration in his voice made her hand tremble slightly as she formed the next number. It's not much learning compared to educated folks. It's extraordinary for anyone, educated or not, she continued writing, cataloging weeks of careful observation in neat columns, cedar shingles, oak planks, pine molding strips, every piece of lumber she had counted and recounted during her solitary pre-dawn hours. When she finished, 3 pages were filled with neat columns of figures that told the story of the mill's true inventory. Caleb took the notebook and studied her work with the concentration of a man reading scripture. This is more detailed than anything I've seen in an official mill record anywhere in the territory. Is that a good thing or a troublesome thing? It's evidence. He closed the notebook carefully, like it contained something precious. Mara, I need to ask something of you, something that might put you in considerable danger. The seriousness in his tone made her throat tighten like someone was pulling a drawstring. What is it? I need you to get into Garrett's office tonight. Look through his files for invoices, purchase orders, anything with numbers that don't match your inventory. I can't do such a thing. You're the only one who can. The workers can't read well enough to spot the discrepancies. The men Garrett trusts are likely in on the fraud, and I can't move around without being spotted by whoever tried to kill me. She stood up, suddenly needing distance from the intensity in his gray eyes. If Garrett catches me in his office, he'll have me arrested for thievery, or worse. I know I'm asking too much of you, but if we don't stop this scheme, Garrett will steal the mill completely. Every job will disappear. Every family will lose their livelihood. Through the office window, she could see workers beginning their shifts. Men she had known for years. Men with wives and children who depended on mill wages to keep body and soul together. Good men who had no idea their trust was being betrayed by someone they'd worked alongside for the better part of a decade. But breaking into Garrett's office meant crossing a line she had never crossed. It meant risking everything on the word of a man she had known for less than a day. How do I know you're telling me the truth about all this? Instead of answering with words, Caleb reached into his jacket again. This time he pulled out a small silver badge, tarnished with age but still bearing clear lettering that made her breath catch. California State, Inspector of Lumber Operations. You're a government inspector. I've been investigating fraudulent lumber sales throughout the territory for the better part of 6 months. Cedar Falls is the 7th mill where I've found evidence of systematic theft from the workers who built it. The badge explained everything. His educated speech, his expensive clothes, his detailed knowledge of mill operations and federal law. It also explained why someone had tried to kill him with such careful planning. Does Garrett know who you really are? He knows enough to want me dead and buried before I can file my report. Mara stared at the badge, her mind racing through all the implications. A government investigation, evidence of fraud that could destroy or save her entire community. She was no longer just helping an injured stranger. She was caught in the middle of something that could change the fate of everyone she had ever known. When would I need to search his office? Tonight, during the monthly poker game at Murphy's Saloon. Garrett never misses it, and he'll be drunk enough to stay until the small hours. She nodded slowly, though her hands were shaking like autumn leaves. What exactly am I looking for? Invoices that show inflated timber purchase prices. Property deeds that aren't properly filed with the county. Correspondence with the Sacramento Valley Syndicate about mill acquisitions. And the morning sun streamed through the office window, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the mill's main saw blade start up for the day's cutting. Normal sounds of a normal morning in a mill town where folks worked hard and trusted their neighbors, except nothing would ever be normal again. Would it, Caleb? She said, and the sound of his given name on her lips felt strangely intimate. What happens if we're wrong about all this? What happens if Garrett really is innocent of such scheming? His gray eyes met hers with an expression that made her stomach drop like a stone in deep water. Then we've just made a very dangerous enemy for no good reason. But there was a bigger question hanging between them, one that neither wanted to voice aloud. What would happen if they were right about Garrett's betrayal? And he realized that a government inspector and an auction girl had uncovered his carefully constructed web of fraud and theft. Because men who attempted murder once rarely hesitated to try again, especially when their freedom and fortune hung in the balance. And as the sound of the mill's machinery filled the morning air with its familiar rhythm, Mara realized that tonight's search might well determine whether Cedar Falls remained a community built on honest labor, or became another ghost town sacrificed to the greed of men who valued profit over human decency. The choice was hers to make, and the consequences would belong to them all. The auction platform stood in the center of Cedar Falls's main square, its wooden planks worn smooth by years of human misery disguised as lawful commerce. Mara's stomach churned like butter in the churn as she approached the familiar structure, knowing that in 3 hours she would stand on those same boards while men bid on her labor like she was prime livestock at the county fair. The monthly auction drew crowds from neighboring towns and settlements, ranchers seeking seasonal help, mill owners looking for cheap labor, and businessmen who viewed human desperation as nothing more than opportunity knocking. Today's crowd was larger than usual. Word had spread that the Sacramento Valley Syndicate was sending representatives to bid on workers for their expanding operations throughout the territory. Mara clutched the small bundle of her possessions, a spare dress, a worn woolen shawl, and the leather notebook Caleb had given her, hidden beneath the other items like contraband. Her hands trembled as she thought about the night ahead, about breaking into Garrett's office while he drank away his poker losses at Murphy's Saloon. You there, girl. She turned to find a well-dressed gentleman approaching, his black suit immaculate despite the dusty street. A gold watch chain gleamed across his vest, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine that reflected the morning sun. Behind him walked 2 other men in similar attire, their eyes surveying the gathering crowd with the calculating gaze of buyers appraising merchandise at market. You work at the lumber mill. I take it, the man asked, his voice carrying the cultured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Yes, sir. Can you read right figures proper? The questions caught her off guard. Most employers never bothered to ask about such skills when hiring auction workers. They assumed illiteracy and planned accordingly. Some, sir, he nodded to one of his companions, who made a notation in a leather-bound ledger with a fountain pen that probably cost more than she earned in a year. We'll be bidding today. Sacramento Valley Syndicate. What's your name? Girl. Mara, sir? Well, Mara, if our bid succeeds, You'll be working in our San Francisco offices. Clean work indoors. Regular wages, paid on time. His smile showed teeth too white and straight to be entirely natural. Much better than mill work. Wouldn't you agree, San Francisco? The name conjured images of a city larger than anything she could imagine, full of strangers who would know nothing of her history or her limitations. But it also meant leaving Cedar Falls, abandoning Caleb, and giving up any chance of helping him expose Garrett's treachery. I appreciate the kind offer, sir, but I'm hoping to stay local if possible. The man's smile faded like morning frost under direct sunlight. Local work is disappearing fast. Girl, mills are consolidating under larger operations. Small concerns can't compete with modern efficiency. He gestured toward the lumber mill visible in the distance, its smokestacks rising against the Sierra Nevada foothills. That mill will be closed within 6 months' time. Workers who adapt to change will prosper. Those who don't. He shrugged with the indifference of a man discussing the weather. After he walked away, Mara found herself staring at the mill's smokestacks. Black smoke rose from the main chimney, visible proof of the industry that kept Cedar Falls alive and breathing. If the syndicate was planning to shut it down, if Garrett was somehow helping them accomplish that goal, Maraba! She turned to find Tom Bradley approaching. His weathered face creased with the kind of a concern that came from genuine worry. Tom had worked at the mill longer than anyone could remember, his expertise with the main saw blade making him one of the most valued workers in the territory. Morning, Tom. Heard you found someone hurt in the lumber yard early this morning. Her throat tightened like someone was pulling a rope around her neck. Where did you hear such a thing? Garrett mentioned it during the shift change. Said Pete's been letting drifters sleep in the office without proper permission. Tom's eyes searched her face with the intensity of a man looking for truth in a world full of lies. This drifter, he say anything to you worth repeating? The question felt loaded with meaning she couldn't quite decipher. He was barely conscious when I found him. Pete says his cot was used, but he don't remember letting nobody stay there overnight. Tom moved closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. Strange things been happening around the mill lately. Equipment breaking down more than usual. Tools going missing. Men getting hurt more often than natural accidents would account for. What kind of accidents? Saw blade came loose yesterday morning. Could have killed Charlie Morrison if he hadn't jumped clear in time. Cable on the main crane snapped last week, dropped a load of timber right where Frank Davies was standing not 5 minutes earlier. Tom's voice dropped it even lower. Starting to wonder if they ain't accidents at all. The crowd around the auction platform was growing larger by the minute. Families with tired faces and calloused hands. Workers whose contracts had ended. Drifters seeking temporary employment. All of them desperate enough to sell their labor to whoever offered the highest bid. No questions asked. Tom, Mara said carefully, what do you know about mill finances? No, we've been working harder for less pay each month. No, timber prices keep going up, but our wages stay exactly the same. His jaw tightened with barely controlled anger. No, Garrett's been meeting with men in fancy suits who talk about efficiency and modernization like they was discussing gospel truth. Before she could respond, a bell rang from the auction platform. Jeremiah Garrett stood at the wooden podium, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. Ladies and gentlemen, Welcome to Cedar Falls monthly labor auction. We have exceptional workers available today, skilled in mill operations, farming, and domestic service of all kinds. Mara's name was called fourth on the list. She climbed the wooden steps on unsteady legs, feeling the platform sway slightly under her weight. The crowd below looked like a sea of upturned faces studying her with the clinical interest of judges evaluating evidence in a court proceeding. Garrett's voice boomed across the square. "This here is Mara, 22 years old, experienced in lumber mill operations, reliable worker with exceptional attention to detail and quality." Bids started at 50 cents per month. The Sacramento Valley Syndicate representative raised his gloved hand immediately, pushing the price to $2. A local rancher countered at $2.50. The syndicate man went to $3 without hesitation. As the bidding continued, Mara found herself scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Tom Bradley watched from near the blacksmith shop, his expression grim as Sunday morning. Other mill workers clustered in small groups, their body language suggesting tension and worry that went deeper than simple concern about employment. But it was a movement near the back of the crowd that made her breath catch in her throat like a fishbone. Caleb Stone stood in the shadow of Murphy's General Store, his dark coat and hat making him nearly invisible among the other spectators. Their eyes met across the distance, and he gave her the slightest nod, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both reassurance and warning. He was supposed to be resting, supposed to be healing from his injuries in the safety of Pete's office. Instead, he was here, watching her auction, putting himself at considerable risk of being spotted by Garrett or the men who had tried to kill him. The bidding reached $4 per month, more money than she had ever earned in her entire life. The syndicate representative looked confident, his local competitors falling back as the price climbed beyond what most area employers could afford to pay. $4.50, called a voice from the crowd. Mara looked toward the sound and saw Caleb step forward, his hand raised in the traditional bidding gesture. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. No one recognized the well-dressed stranger who was challenging the syndicate's bid with such casual confidence. Garrett's eyes narrowed as he studied Caleb with obvious suspicion. "Sir, we'll need to see proof of funds before accepting bids of this magnitude." Caleb reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather wallet. He pulled out several bills and held them up for Garrett to see, the money crisp and new in the afternoon sunlight. $5 per month, 1-year contract, payment in advance. The syndicate representative leaned over to whisper something urgent to his companion, their expressions suddenly tense as storm clouds. After a brief conference conducted in hushed tones, he shook his head and stepped back from the bidding. "Sold to the gentleman for $5 per month," Garrett announced, though his voice carried an edge of suspicion sharp enough to cut glass. As Mara descended from the platform, her mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Why had Caleb risked exposure to bid on her contract? How did an injured government inspector have enough ready cash to outbid the syndicate? And why did Garrett look like a man who had just witnessed something that worried him considerable? She met Caleb near the edge of the dispersing crowd, her hands shaking as she handed him the contract papers. "What are you doing here?" she whispered urgently. "Making sure you stay in Cedar Falls long enough to help me finish this investigation." His gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her stomach flutter strangely. But we may have a serious problem. What kind of problem? He nodded toward the syndicate representatives, who were engaged in heated conversation with Garrett near the auction platform. They're not acting like men who just lost a simple bidding war. They're acting like men who recognize something they didn't expect to see, as if summoned by his words. The lead syndicate representative turned in their direction, his gaze fixed on Caleb with unmistakable recognition, and his hand moved towards something concealed beneath his expensive jacket. "Caleb," Mara breathed, fear making her voice barely audible. "I think they know exactly who you are." The crowd was dispersing now, people heading home or to the saloon to celebrate or commiserate over the day's transactions. But the syndicate men weren't leaving with the others. They were moving through the thinning crowd with predatory purpose, their attention focused entirely on Caleb and Mara. Whatever dangerous game they had been playing was drawing to a close. The real peril was just beginning, and this time, there would be nowhere safe to hide. Caleb's hand closed around Mara's elbow, his grip firm but gentle. "Walk with me toward the mill. Don't look back, and keep your pace natural." The syndicate men were 40 feet behind them, moving through the dispersing crowd with the calculated casualness of hunters who had spotted their quarry. Their polished boots clicked against the wooden boardwalk in measured rhythm, neither hurrying nor falling behind the patient pursuit of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Who are they exactly?" Mara whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of departing townspeople. "Men who work for people. I've been investigating for the better part of 6 months." Caleb's breathing was controlled, but she could feel tension radiating from his body like heat from a forge. "Men who have excellent reasons to want me dead and buried." And they turned onto Mill Street, passing Murphy's General Store and the blacksmith shop, where the afternoon rang with the sound of hammer on anvil. The familiar sights of Cedar Falls looked different. Now doorways that could hide watchers, alleys that offered either escape routes or perfect spots for ambush. The town she had known all her life had become a chessboard, where every move carried consequences that could prove fatal. Behind them, the footsteps continued their steady pursuit, never closer, never farther. "The lumber yard," Caleb said quietly. "There's a storage shed behind the main building. Can you get us there without being seen by half the town?" Mara nodded, leading him down a narrow path between two buildings that most folks never noticed. The route would take them behind the hardware store and the seamstress shop, emerging near the mill's eastern fence line. It was a path she had used countless times when avoiding unwanted attention from drunk mill workers or hostile townspeople who enjoyed reminding auction girls of their place in the social order. They slipped between stacks of empty barrels behind Wilson's Hardware, the smell of sawdust and machine oil growing stronger as they approached the mill property. Somewhere ahead, she could hear the distant sound of the main saw blade cutting through timber. The afternoon shift was still hard at their work, unaware that danger was stalking through their peaceful community. Caleb stumbled slightly, his hand pressing against his ribs where the morning's injury still pained him. The day's exertion was taking its toll on his battered body, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. How much farther? 50 yards through that gap in the fence, and they squeezed through a break in the wooden fencing that mill workers had been using as a shortcut for years. On the other side lay the lumberyard's storage area, towering stacks of seasoning timber, mountains of sawdust, and several weathered sheds used for equipment storage. The shed Mara led him to was smaller than the others, tucked between two massive stacks of pine boards, like a secret hidden in plain sight. She pulled open the wooden door, and they stepped into the musty darkness. Shafts of afternoon sunlight slanted through gaps in the wallboards, illuminating stored hand tools, coils of hemp rope, and the accumulated dust of years. Caleb leaned against a workbench, his face pale with exhaustion and pain. Those men at the auction, they're not just syndicate buyers looking for cheap labor. They're enforcers, men who make problems disappear without a trace. How can you be so certain? Because I've seen their handiwork in other mill towns. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the leather notebook she had used that morning, its pages now seeming to hold the weight of the world. In Stockton, a mill foreman who was stealing timber profits was found floating face down in the San Joaquin River. In Fresno, a bookkeeper who discovered fraudulent invoices died in a warehouse fire that the local sheriff ruled accidental. Mara's hands began to shake like autumn leaves in a strong wind. They actually kill people. They eliminate obstacles to profit. Nothing personal, just business. His gray eyes met hers with deadly seriousness. And right now, were the biggest obstacles they've encountered. Outside, she could hear voices approaching through the lumber stacks. Male voices, speaking in low tones that carried the unmistakable cadence of men discussing violence. Caleb moved to the small window and peered through a crack between the weathered boards. Two of them, searching the lumber stacks one by one, working their way toward us. There's another way out, Mara whispered. Through the back wall. One of the boards has been loose for years. She showed him where decades of weather had loosened a board near the floor. It swung outward on rusted nails, creating an opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. But as Caleb knelt to examine it, his movement caused several tools hanging on the wall to clatter together like wind chimes in a storm. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, echoing off the wooden walls. Outside, the approaching voices stopped dead. Mara held her breath until her lungs burned, every muscle in her body rigid with terror. Through the gap in the wallboards, she could see a shadow moving between the lumber stacks, getting closer with each passing second. Caleb's hand found hers in the dim light. His palm was warm, calloused from honest work, but steady, despite the mortal danger surrounding them. For a moment, the simple human contact was more reassuring than any weapon could have been. The shadow stopped directly outside their hiding place, so close she could hear the man's breathing. "Check that shed," a voice commanded. The accent was American, but with undertones of something else, Eastern education perhaps, or the refinement that came from associating with wealthy men who valued results over methods. Heavy footsteps approached the door with the deliberate pace of a man who expected to find what he was looking for. Caleb released her hand and moved to the loose board, pushing it outward to create their escape route. But as he shifted his weight, the ancient floorboard beneath him creaked with a sound like breaking bones. The footsteps outside paused. Then, suddenly, they quickened to a run, heading directly for the door. "Go!" Caleb whispered urgently, pushing her toward the opening. Mara dropped to her hands and knees, squeezing through the gap in the wall with desperate haste. Splinters caught at her dress, and dirt filled her mouth as she crawled into the narrow space between the shed and a towering stack of lumber that rose 15 feet above them. Behind her, she heard the shed door crash open with violent force. "Empty," a voice said, with obvious frustration. "But someone was here recently. The dust on the floor shows clear disturbance." Caleb appeared beside her, having squeezed through the opening with surprising speed for an injured man. They were trapped now in a space barely 2 feet wide, pressed between the shed wall and a stack of lumber that blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight. Through gaps in the lumber stack, she could see one of the syndicate men searching the area around the shed. He moved with professional efficiency, checking every possible hiding place with the thoroughness of someone trained in the art of pursuit and capture. "Spread out," he called to his companion. "They're here somewhere, and they can't have gone far." The man's boots appeared inches from Mara's face as he walked along the base of the lumber stack. If he looked down, if he noticed the disturbed dirt where they had crawled through the gap, and something metallic pressed against her back. She turned her head slightly and saw that Caleb had drawn a knife from his boot, not a large blade, but one designed for close, deadly work. His eyes met hers in the dim light, and she understood his unspoken message. If they were discovered, he would fight to protect her, but against 2 armed men in his injured condition. The outcome was as certain as sunrise. The boots moved past their hiding place. She heard the searcher checking the next shed, rattling the door handle and peering through gaps in the weathered walls. "Nothing here either," he reported with growing irritation. "They couldn't have gone far on foot. That inspector was injured this morning. And the girl's never been more than 5 miles from this mill in her entire life, Inspector." They knew exactly who Caleb was, and they had been watching her long enough to know her habits and limitations. "Boss wants this business finished before tonight's poker game. Garrett's getting nervous about the federal investigation, and nervous men make mistakes." The words hit Mara like physical blows. Garrett was working directly with the syndicate men, the mill foreman she had known for years. The man who controlled the livelihood of every worker in Cedar Falls was part of whatever scheme had brought killers to their peaceful community. What about the girl? Collateral damage. She's seen too much, knows too much. Can't risk her talking to the wrong people. Mara's throat constricted until she could barely breathe. They weren't just hunting Caleb anymore. They were hunting both of them, and they had no intention of leaving witnesses to testify about what they had discovered. The voices grew fainter as the men moved their search to other areas of the lumberyard, but they would be back. Professional hunters didn't abandon a trail when their quarry had simply gone to ground temporarily. "We need to get to Garrett's office tonight," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible even inches from her ear. "Those documents are the only evidence that can stop this conspiracy before it spreads to other communities. They'll be watching every move we make. Then we'll have to be smarter and more careful than they are." His gray eyes held hers with desperate intensity. "Mara, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen. If something does, you need to get word to the federal marshal in Sacramento. Tell him about the fraudulent timber sales, about the syndicate's connection to Garrett and the other mill owners. Tell him Inspector Stone was murdered investigating lumber mill fraud throughout the territory." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. A government investigation that could save or destroy entire communities now depended on a woman who most people considered less valuable than the horses that pulled their wagons. How will I prove any of it without proper evidence? The notebook. Your inventory records will show the discrepancies in mill production that prove systematic theft. He pressed something into her palm, a brass key that felt warm from his body heat. This opens a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Sacramento. Inside, you'll find copies of all my investigation files covering 7 different mill towns. The key was small, but surprisingly heavy, representing evidence that could expose a conspiracy involving fraudulent land deals, systematic theft from working families, and the murders of honest men who had tried to stand in the way of easy profit. It also represented a death sentence for anyone caught possessing it. Outside their hiding place, the afternoon shadows were growing longer as the sun moved toward the western mountains. Soon the mill whistle would blow, ending the work shift and sending dozens of workers through the lumberyard. In the confusion of men heading home to their families, they might be able to escape undetected. But as Mara clutched the key in her sweating palm, she realized that escape was no longer the primary goal. Tonight, while Garrett played poker and drank himself into carelessness, she would break into his office and search for the evidence that could save Cedar Falls or die in the attempt. The only question was whether Caleb would survive long enough to help her, or whether she would be facing the syndicate's killers entirely alone. From somewhere beyond the lumber stacks, she heard one of the searchers call out to his companion with renewed excitement. Found something over here. Fresh tracks leading toward the main mill building. They were about to be discovered. And this time, there was nowhere left to run except straight into the arms of men who had already proven they would kill without hesitation to protect their secrets. The mill whistle's blast shattered the afternoon silence, signaling the end of the work shift. Within seconds, the lumberyard filled with the voices and heavy footsteps of workers heading home to their suppers and families. Mara pressed herself deeper into the narrow space between the Chesson and lumberstack, feeling Caleb's body tense beside her as boots thundered past their hiding place. "Now," Caleb whispered. They crawled out from their hiding spot, dirt clinging to their clothes and sawdust filling their hair like gray snow. The departing workers provided perfect cover as they slipped between lumber stacks and made their way toward the mill's main building. Just 2 more figures in the evening exodus. But as they rounded the corner near the mill office, Mara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. 3 black carriages sat in front of the mill entrance, their polished surfaces gleaming in the late afternoon sun like beetles' shells. Men in expensive suits stood beside the vehicles, speaking in low voices with Jeremiah Garrett. At the center of the group was a tall man with silver hair and a gold-headed walking stick, someone whose very presence commanded immediate respect from everyone around him. "Samuel Morrison," Caleb breathed beside her, "president of the Sacramento Valley Syndicate. What's he doing here in Cedar Falls, cleaning up loose ends before they become permanent problems?" As they watched from behind a pile of sawdust, Morrison gestured toward the mill building with his walking stick while speaking in cultured tones that carried the authority of wealth and power. Garrett nodded rapidly, his usual confidence replaced by nervous deference that made him look like a schoolboy being scolded by the headmaster. Even from 50 yards away, Mara could see dark sweat stains on the foreman's shirt despite the cooling evening air. "Gentlemen," Morrison's voice carried across the yard with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Time is of the essence in matters such as these. Our inspector friend has caused considerable inconvenience, but that ends today, inspector friend." They were talking about Caleb as if he were already dead. One of Morrison's men stepped forward, the same syndicate representative who had bid at the auction earlier. "We tracked them to the storage area, but they slipped away during the shift change confusion. No matter whatsoever," Morrison replied with cold indifference. "They can't leave town undetected. Too many watchful eyes. Too few roads leading out of the territory." He turned to Garrett with the casual authority of a man giving orders to a servant. "Your responsibility is quite simple. Jeremiah, ensure they don't live to file any reports with federal authorities." The words hit Mara like physical blows to her stomach. She had grown up knowing Garrett as a harsh but fundamentally honest man who worked alongside his crew during the hardest jobs. Seeing him nod agreement to murder orders destroyed something inside her chest that she couldn't name or repair. "What about the mill workers?" Garrett asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some of them are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about the recent accidents." "Accidents happen in dangerous occupations," Morrison said with the indifference of a man discussing livestock prices. "Men who ask too many questions tend to have more accidents than others. It's simply natural selection at work in the industrial age." Caleb's hand found hers, squeezing tight enough to leave marks on her fingers. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow and rapid, like a man trying not to be sick. The conversation they were witnessing was confirmation of everything he had suspected. But hearing murder discussed so casually carried a different kind of horror than reading about it in official reports. "The mill closure proceeds exactly as planned." Morrison continued in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. "Workers will be relocated to syndicate operations in San Francisco. Those who refuse relocation will find themselves unemployed indefinitely." "What about the property compensation we discussed?" Garrett's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "Already arranged through our usual channels. Your share will be deposited in the agreed account once the final paperwork is processed." Morrison's smile held no warmth whatsoever. $30,000. Jeremiah, more money than you'd earn in 10 years of honest mill work. $30,000? The sum was beyond anything Mara could comprehend, more than the entire town's combined wages for a year. Blood money paid for betraying every family in Cedar Falls, every man who had trusted Garrett with their livelihoods and their lives. Morrison consulted a gold pocket watch with the casual gesture of a man whose time was worth more than most people's annual wages. "I have pressing business in Sacramento this evening. This matter will be resolved completely before my return tomorrow morning, or there will be serious consequences for everyone involved in this unfortunate delay." The threat in his cultivated voice made Garrett's face go pale as fresh milk. "Understood completely, sir." "Excellent." Morrison climbed into the lead carriage with the practiced ease of wealth and privilege. "Oh, and Jeremiah, the girl who was with our inspector friend, she's become a liability as well. Handle her accordingly." As the carriages pulled away, their wheels crunching on gravel and their occupants already discussing other business. Was Mara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The shame of being discussed like a problem to be eliminated, mixed with rage so pure it made her hands shake like she had fever chills. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated as disposable, tired of watching good people suffer while men like Morrison and Garrett profited from their misery. But more than anger, she felt shame burning in her stomach like acid. Shame that she had been so easily fooled by Garrett's pretense of decency. Shame that she had spent years being grateful for the privilege of working in his mill, while he planned to steal it from under the workers who had built it with their sweat and sacrifice. "We have to stop them," she whispered, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Caleb studied her face with an expression she couldn't read. "Mara, you don't understand the full scope of what you're saying. These aren't just common thieves stealing lumber scraps. They're killers who've murdered people in at least 3 other mill towns. Then we stop them here in Cedar Falls. How I'm one injured inspector with no backup. And you're..." He stopped himself, but the incomplete sentence hung between them like a blade poised to cut. "I'm what exactly? A worthless auction girl who can't read proper or write her name in fancy script." The words tasted like sawdust and shame in her mouth. Someone who don't matter enough for anyone to miss when she disappears into the night. "That's not what I meant at all. It's exactly what you meant." She stood up, dirt and sawdust falling from her dress like evidence of her degradation. "Maybe that's the honest truth about me. Maybe I am just some nobody who ain't got 2 cents to her name or enough learning to matter to anyone important." Caleb reached for her arm, but she stepped back out of his reach. "But I know this mill better than any fancy government inspector from Sacramento. I know which boards creak and which windows don't latch proper. I know when Garrett takes his bottle from his desk drawer and how much whiskey it takes to make him careless with his secrets." Her voice was getting stronger, fueled by anger and desperation and something else she couldn't name. "Most important, I know that every man, woman, and child in this town is going to lose everything they've worked for if we don't stop Morrison and Garrett tonight. The odds against us, the odds don't matter one whit when you got nothing left to lose." She pulled the brass key from her pocket, holding it up so it caught the fading sunlight like a prosopha or a threat. "You gave me this key because you trust me to use it if something happens to you. Well, something's about to happen to all of us." "Barrio." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her stomach flutter, despite their desperate circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she had never heard before. "You're not worthless. Mara, you're the strongest person I've ever had the privilege to know." The words should have provided comfort. Instead, they felt like a goodbye spoken over a grave not yet dug. "Tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "While Garrett's at Murphy's saloon, losing his blood money at poker, I'm getting into his office and finding every piece of evidence that proves what him and Morrison are doing to our community. It's too dangerous for you to attempt alone. Then come with me. I can barely stand upright for more than a few minutes at a time. You saw what happened when I tried to run from those syndicate men." His jaw tightened with frustration and self-recrimination. "I'll slow you down. Make noise at the wrong moment. Get us both killed for no good reason. She knew he was right, but knowing didn't make acceptance any easier to swallow. What if I find the evidence but can't get out of town alive to use it? Then you send word to Federal Marshal William Hayes in Sacramento. Tell him, Inspector Stone was murdered investigating timber fraud. Tell him the Sacramento Valley Syndicate is using murder and intimidation to steal mill properties throughout the territory. He pressed a folded paper into her hand with obvious reluctance. That's Hayes's address. He's one of the few men in territorial government who can't be bought with syndicate money. The paper felt fragile between her fingers, like it might disintegrate from the weight of responsibility it carried. Around them, the lumberyard was growing quiet as the last workers headed home to their families and their evening meals. Soon, darkness would fall over Cedar Falls, and with it would come the most dangerous night in the town's short history. Caleb, she said quietly, what happens if we're both wrong about Garrett? What if he really is just a foreman, trying to keep his job in difficult times, instead of answering with words? Caleb pointed toward the mill office. Through the window, they could see Garrett piling papers into a leather satchel with quick, nervous movements that spoke of guilt and fear. Even from their distant vantage point, his desperation was written in every furtive glance toward the door, every hurried motion as he prepared to destroy evidence of his betrayal. Men who have nothing to hide don't burn important documents at sunset, Caleb said grimly, as if summoned by his words. Garrett struck a match and held it to a stack of papers. Flames licked upward, consuming what might have been invoices, contracts, or correspondence with syndicate officials, evidence literally going up in smoke while they watched helplessly from the shadows. He's destroying everything important, Mara breathed. Not everything. Men like Garrett always keep insurance policies documents that prove his superior's guilt if he needs to bargain for his own life. Caleb's eyes met hers with desperate intensity. Those documents will be hidden somewhere. Morrison's people can't find them easily. Somewhere only Garrett knows about. His house would be too obvious by far. Morrison's people will search there first. Caleb paused, thinking hard. Somewhere at the mill, but not in the office where others might stumble across them. Somewhere he can access easily, but others wouldn't think to look. Through the office window, they watched Garrett stamp out the last of the burning papers and gather his remaining belongings. In minutes, he would leave for Murphy's saloon and his weekly poker game, giving them their only chance to search the mill for whatever evidence he had hidden away. But as Garrett emerged from the office and locked the door behind him, Mar noticed something that made her blood freeze like January creek water. Two men in dark coats stepped out of the shadows near the mill entrance. Flanking Garrett as he walked toward town, they weren't syndicate enforcers. Their clothes were too plain, their movements too familiar. They were mill workers, local men she recognized from years of shared labor, now serving as Garrett's personal guards. "Caleb," she whispered, horror creeping into her voice like poison. "How many people in Cedar Falls do you reckon Morrison's been paying for their silence?" The question hung between them like a death sentence. If Garrett had corrupted local workers, if the syndicate's influence extended beyond just the mill foreman, then their mission had become infinitely more dangerous than either had imagined. They weren't just fighting corporate fraud anymore. They were fighting neighbors and friends. People who had shared meals at church socials and helped raise barns during harvest time. People who were now willing to betray their own community for syndicate money. And somewhere in the darkening mill, hidden evidence waited that could expose the full extent of the conspiracy if they could find it before Morrison's expanding network of local collaborators found them first. But the biggest question of all remained unspoken in a town where neighbors had turned against neighbors for the promise of easy money. Who could they trust to help them when the killing finally started? The coal oil lamp cast dancing shadows across Garrett's office as Mara worked the makeshift lockpick Caleb had fashioned from a bent nail. Her hands trembled with each careful movement, sweat making her fingers slippery despite the cool night air seeping through the office windows like unwelcome breath. "Almost there," she whispered to herself, feeling the lock mechanism respond to gentle pressure. The metal clicked softly, and the door swung open with a familiar squeak. Inside, the smell of burned paper still lingered in the air like the ghost of destroyed secrets. Garrett's desk was cleared except for a brass inkwell and a single ledger book left open to a page covered with neat columns of numbers. Mara approached it carefully, her worn boots silent on the wooden floor. The ledger showed timber purchases for the past month. 2 columns of figures, side by side, one showing actual payments to local cutters. Another showing what the syndicate claimed to have paid. The difference between the columns represented thousands of dollars in stolen profit, money taken from the pockets of honest working families. But ledger books could be dismissed as simple clerical errors. She needed something more damning: correspondence. Contracts. Solid evidence of the conspiracy Morrison had outlined that very afternoon. She searched the desk drawers methodically, her finger probing every corner and crevice. The bottom drawer stuck, warped from years of moisture and neglect. When she finally worked it free with both hands, her breath caught in her throat. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with ordinary string, their official letterheads clearly visible in the lamplight. Sacramento Valley Syndicate, California State Land Office, Federal Timber Authority. The first letter made her stomach clench with righteous anger. It was dated 3 months earlier, addressed to Garrett from Morrison's San Francisco office. Our arrangement proceeds exactly as discussed in our previous correspondence. Worker displacement must appear gradual to avoid unwanted federal scrutiny. Accidents should increase in frequency but maintain plausible explanations. Your continued cooperation ensures the agreed compensation upon successful mill closure. The second letter was worse by far. A detailed list of mill workers marked for relocation assistance. A cold euphemism that chilled her blood when she saw the notations beside some familiar names. Resistant to change requires additional persuasion. Tom Bradley's name was on that list. So was old Pete Robbins. Men whose only crime was loyalty to honest work and fair wages for all. But the third letter made her hand shake so violently she nearly dropped it on the floor. It was addressed to someone called the Facilitator and signed by Morrison himself in flowing script. The contents outlined a detailed plan to eliminate not just witnesses to syndicate fraud, but anyone whose testimony could connect the Sacramento operation to similar schemes in other mill towns throughout the territory. Caleb Stone's name appeared twice in the letter. So did hers, written in the same casual tone Morrison might use to discuss the weather. Evidence of Inspector Stone's investigation must be completely destroyed, Morrison had written in his educated hand. The auction girl who aided him represents a continuing liability. Both eliminations should appear accidental to avoid federal interest. She was folding the letters to take with her when voices approached from outside the mill. Multiple voices, speaking in the careful tones of men trying not to be overheard by anyone who might object to their nighttime business. Mara blew out the lamp and moved to the window. Through the glass, she could see lantern light moving between the lumber stacks like fireflies in summer darkness. At least 4 men searching the yard with the systematic thoroughness of a military patrol. They had discovered her absence from the boarding house where auction workers were required to spend their nights. Now they were hunting her with deadly purpose. She stuffed the letters into her dress pocket and moved toward the office door. But as she stepped into the hallway, a floorboard creaked beneath her weight with a sound that seemed loud as thunder in the silent building. The searching voices outside went silent as the grave. "Someone's inside the mill," a voice called out. She recognized it with a sinking heart. Frank Davies, a saw operator she had known for 3 years, a man whose children she had helped feed when times were lean, now tracking her like dangerous game. "Check all the buildings systematically," another voice commanded with military precision. "Morrison wants this business finished before sunrise." Mara crept through the mill's main floor, using her intimate knowledge of the building to avoid the loose boards and squeaky hinges that would betray her presence to the hunters. The massive machinery loomed around her in the darkness. Enormous saws and conveyor belts that had defined the rhythm of her working life for years. Behind her, she heard the office door open with violent force. Light spilled into the hallway as someone discovered her break-in with obvious satisfaction. "She was here all right." Frank's voice carried through the building like an accusation. "Office has been thoroughly searched." "Find her quickly," came the reply. "Boss made it clear. No witnesses remain alive this time." "Boss?" They weren't talking about Garrett anymore. Morrison had corrupted enough local men to mount a serious hunt through the mill property, turning neighbors into executioners. Mara reached the building's rear exit, but as she touched the door handle, she heard voices approaching from that direction as well. Heavy boots crunching on gravel, moving with purpose. They had surrounded the mill completely. Panic rose in her throat like bile. The building that had sheltered her honest work for years had become a trap, and the men hunting her were neighbors who had shared church pews and helped raise community barns during harvest season. But panic wouldn't save her life tonight. Knowledge would. She remembered the maintenance ladder bolted to the mill's central support beam, a narrow iron route that led to a storage loft beneath the roof where spare equipment gathered dust. If she could reach it without making noise, she could hide until the searchers moved on to other areas. The ladder was 15 feet of iron rungs leading to a storage space that most people forgot existed entirely. Mara climbed slowly, testing each rung before trusting her full weight to it, her dress catching on rough metal edges. Halfway up, her foot slipped on a rung slick with machine oil. The metallic scrape echoed through the building like a church bell, calling sinners to judgment. "There," Frank's voice called out with unmistakable satisfaction. Near the main support beam, lantern light swept the mill floor as the searchers converged on her position like wolves closing on wounded prey. She pressed herself against the support beam, trying to become invisible in the shadows cast by the overhead machinery. But invisibility had been her survival mechanism for too many years. Tonight, she needed something more powerful than hiding. "Frank Davies," she called out, her voice carrying through the building with surprising authority. "I know you're down there." The searchers froze like deer hearing the hunters approach. In the sudden silence, she could hear their breathing. The creak of leather boots on weathered wooden floors. "I know exactly why you're here," she continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Morrison's paying you good money to hunt me down like a rabid dog." "Come down, Mara," Frank called back. And there was something in his voice that almost sounded like genuine regret. "Nobody wants to hurt you unnecessarily." "Liar." The word cut through the darkness like a blade drawn for battle. "I read Morrison's letters. Frank, I know what happens to people who get in his way." She pulled one of the syndicate letters from her pocket. Though they couldn't see it in the darkness, "I'm holding a letter from Morrison to Jeremiah Garrett right now. It lists the names of mill workers marked for elimination. Your name is on that list. Frank Davies." Silence stretched through the building like a held breath. She could feel uncertainty ripple through the search party like wind through wheat. "You're lying to save your own skin," Frank said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Am I lying, Frank? Think about it careful-like. You know things about the syndicate's operation that could hurt them in court. You've seen the accidents that weren't accidents. What happens when Morrison decides you know too much for his comfort?" She could hear whispered conversations among the searchers now, men beginning to question their orders, to wonder about their own safety in Morrison's grand scheme. "Tom Bradley's name is on the list too," she called out with growing confidence. "So is Pete Robbins. Any man who might testify about what really happened in this mill." "That's quite enough," a new voice commanded sharply, someone she didn't recognize. One of Morrison's outside men, trying to regain control of a situation slipping away from him. But Frank Davies had stopped moving toward the ladder. "What list exactly?" he asked, and Mara could hear genuine worry creeping into his voice like poison. "The elimination list," she replied with deadly certainty. "Morrison can't risk any witnesses to his fraud scheme surviving to testify in federal court. That includes everyone he paid to help him steal this mill." The stranger's voice cracked like a whip. "She's playing for time while help arrives. Get her down from there immediately." But none of the local men moved forward. They were thinking now, remembering incidents that had seemed like accidents, co-workers who had disappeared or died after asking inconvenient questions about mill operations. "Frank," Mara said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of shared history, "you got 3 children and a wife who depends on you coming home alive. Is Morrison's blood money worth risking their futures?" The silence stretched until she could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like distant thunder. "Let her go!" The words came from Frank Davies, spoken with the authority of a man who had made a decision that might cost him everything. "You're making a serious mistake," the stranger warned with obvious menace. "Maybe so," Frank replied with growing conviction. "But I ain't gonna murder a woman for asking the wrong questions about her own workplace." One by one, the other local men lowered their lanterns. Pete Robbins stepped out of the shadows, his weathered face creased with shame that seemed to age him 10 years. "I'm sorry, Mara," he said quietly. "Morrison promised us steady work when the mill closed. We were desperate enough to believe his lies. I know. Pete, desperate times make folks do desperate things. And the stranger backed toward the door, his hand moving towards something concealed beneath his expensive coat. This isn't finished by any measure. Morrison has other resources at his disposal. Maybe he does, Frank said, moving to block the stranger's path to the exit. But you ain't using Cedar Falls men to do your killing anymore, as the stranger disappeared into the night. Mara climbed down from her hiding place among the rafters. The letters in her pocket felt heavier now, evidence that could save or destroy everyone in the building, depending on how wisely it was used. "What do we do now?" Pete asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen his own moral failures clearly. Before she could answer, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the mill yard. Multiple riders, approaching fast from the direction of town with urgent purpose. Through the mill windows, they could see torch flames dancing in the darkness like fallen stars. Morrison had arrived with serious reinforcements, and this time, he wouldn't be relying on a local cooperation to finish what he had started. "Frank," Mara said urgently, "how many men does Morrison have with him out there?" But as they peered through the windows at the approaching torches, they realized the riders weren't Morrison's men at all. They were federal marshals, their badges gleaming in the torchlight, riding hard toward the mill with the full authority of the United States government behind them. The question that remained was whether they had come to arrest the conspirators and restore justice to Cedar Falls, or whether Morrison's influence had reached even the federal level, making them all witnesses to their own executions. And if the marshals were working for Morrison, then Mara and everyone who had helped her were about to face something far worse than local corruption. They were about to confront the full power of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government itself. The federal marshals dismounted outside the mill with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to dangerous work in hostile territory. Their leader, a tall man with steel gray hair and a badge that caught the torchlight like a promise of justice, approached the mill entrance with measured steps that spoke of authority earned through years of honest service. "Federal Marshal William Hayes," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of legitimate government power. "We're looking for Inspector Caleb Stone." Mara's breath caught in her throat like a prayer answered. These weren't Morrison's men. They were the reinforcements Caleb had been expecting all along. "Marshal," she called from the mill doorway, stepping into the circle of torchlight with hands raised to show she carried no weapons. "Inspector Stone is injured, but alive. I'm Mara. I've been helping with his investigation." Hayes studied her with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance, from her dirt-stained dress to the determined set of her shoulders. Behind him, his deputies maintained positions that covered all approaches to the mill with professional competence. "Miss, we received a telegraph from Inspector Stone 3 days ago requesting immediate assistance with a fraud investigation. His last communication indicated he was in mortal danger." He was right about that. She pulled Morrison's letters from her dress pocket, her hands steady now despite everything she had endured. "The Sacramento Valley Syndicate has been systematically stealing mill properties throughout the territory. They tried to kill Inspector Stone to stop his investigation." Hayes took the letters, scanning their contents by torchlight with the concentration of a man who had seen such evidence before. His jaw tightened as he read Morrison's explicit instructions for the elimination of witnesses. "Where is Inspector Stone at this moment?" "Hidden in the lumberyard. He's badly injured from the attempt on his life this morning. And these men, Hayes gestured toward Frank Davies and Pete Robbins, who stood uncertainly in the mill entrance like men waiting for judgment. Local workers who were deceived by the syndicate's promises of steady employment. They chose to help me instead of continuing to hunt me down like a wild animal. Frank stepped forward, his weathered hands twisting his hat brim with obvious nervousness. Marshal, we made serious mistakes tonight. Got fooled by men who promised us work when they were planning to steal everything we'd built with our own hands. Hayes nodded with the understanding of a man who had seen good people make bad choices under desperate circumstances. Cooperation will be noted favorably in my official report. Where can we find the syndicate leadership? Jeremiah Garrett should be at Murphy's Saloon playing poker, Mara replied. Samuel Morrison returned to Sacramento this afternoon, but he'll be back tomorrow morning expecting this matter resolved permanently. Not the way he planned it. Hayes turned to his deputies with crisp efficiency. Johnson, take 2 men and arrest Garrett. Bring him back alive. We need his testimony to prosecute the full conspiracy. Williams, secure the mill premises and collect any remaining evidence of fraudulent operations. As the marshals dispersed to their assigned tasks, Hayes addressed Mara directly with the respect due to someone who had risked everything for justice. Miss, I'll need you to guide me to Inspector Stone. His testimony will be crucial for prosecuting this case in federal court. She led Hayes and 1 deputy through the lumber yard toward the storage shed where Caleb waited. The familiar paths felt different now, no longer routes of desperate escape, but simply walkways through a mill yard that would continue operating under honest management for generations to come. They found Caleb conscious but pale, propped against Pete's old cot with obvious pain etched in his weathered features. His face brightened when he saw Hayes approaching with the confidence of federal authority behind him. Marshal Hayes, I wasn't certain my telegraph had reached you safely. It did, along with some very disturbing accusations about syndicate operations throughout the territory. Hayes knelt beside the cot, examining Caleb's injuries with the concern of a man who valued good subordinates. How badly are you hurt? Cracked ribs, possible concussion, various cuts and bruises. Nothing that won't heal with proper rest and medical attention. Caleb's eyes found Mara's across the small room. But I couldn't have survived without Miss Mara's help. She saved my life and risked her own to gather the evidence you'll need for prosecution. Hayes looked between them with an expression that suggested he understood more about their partnership than either had spoken aloud. The evidence Miss Mara provided shows systematic fraud involving multiple mill operations, forged land transfers, and conspiracy to commit murder. This case will require extensive federal prosecution reaching into several states. What happens to the mill? Mara asked, voicing the concern that weighed heaviest on her heart. What happens to the workers and their families? The syndicate's fraudulent claims will be voided through federal court action. Property ownership reverts to the legitimate holders in this case. The worker cooperative that originally established the mill through collective investment, Hayes consulted a leather-bound notebook filled with careful handwriting. Inspector Stone's investigation revealed that most of these mills were built through worker investment and sweat equity, not syndicate capital. The words took a long moment to penetrate her understanding. The mill belonged to the workers who had built it. It always had, despite Morrison's schemes to steal it through legal manipulation. Marshal, Caleb said carefully. There's another matter of justice. Miss Mara has been living under the auction system, essentially legalized slavery. I'd like to request that her current contract be voided as part of this federal investigation. The auction system violates federal labor laws established after the war between the states. Hayes replied with the authority of constitutional law. All such contracts in this territory are hereby deemed invalid and unenforceable. Mara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like the settling of a foundation stone. For the first time in her adult life, she belonged to no one but herself and the God who had made her outside the shed. They could hear voices approaching through the lumber stacks. Hayes stepped to the door, his hand resting on his sidearm with practiced readiness. But the voices belonged to his deputies, returning with their prisoner and evidence of the conspiracy. Jeremiah Garrett stumbled between two marshals, his clothes disheveled and whiskey-stained from his interrupted poker game. When he saw Caleb alive and Mara standing freely beside the federal officers, his face went ashen as morning mist. "Jeremiah Garrett," Hayes announced with formal authority, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, forgery of federal documents, and conspiracy to commit murder." Garrett's shoulders sagged as the weight of his situation became clear. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Morrison promised the workers would be relocated to other jobs with better pay." "Men like Morrison don't relocate workers," Caleb said quietly. "They eliminate them as unnecessary business expenses." "What happens to me now?" Garrett asked. And for the first time in years, he sounded like the uncertain man Mara remembered from his early days as mill foreman. "You cooperate fully with federal prosecution," Hayes replied. "Testify against Morrison and the syndicate's other operations throughout the territory. Help us shut down their schemes before more honest workers die for the crime of building something valuable." As Hayes led Garrett away for formal processing, Mara found herself alone with Caleb in the quiet shed. The coal oil lamp cast warm light across his face, highlighting the exhaustion and pain he had endured for the sake of justice. "It's finished," she said softly, hardly daring to believe it. "This part is finished, but there's still important work to be done." He struggled to sit up straighter, despite obvious discomfort. "The mill will need new management, someone who understands both the technical operations and the workers' needs and rights. Tom Bradley knows the machinery better than anyone in the territory. I was thinking of someone who understands numbers, inventory management, and fair labor practices." His gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Someone who's proven she can stand up to powerful men when principles are at stake." The suggestion hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm of social expectations. "Caleb, I can barely read and write proper English. I don't know the first thing about running a mill operation. You know more about this mill's day-to-day operations than anyone alive. You can learn the rest: bookkeeping, correspondence, management techniques." He leaned forward, ignoring the obvious pain the movement caused. "Mara, you saved this entire community tonight. You took evidence from dangerous criminals and used it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." Through the shed's small window, she could see the first hint of dawn touching the eastern mountains with golden light. A new day beginning for Cedar Falls, free from the corruption that had threatened to destroy everything decent people had built. "What about you?" she asked. Marshal Hayes will want you to testify in Sacramento and other cities. The trials will take months of preparation and testimony. But after that, he paused, studying her face in the lamplight. After that, I'd like to stay in Cedar Falls, help establish the new management structure, make sure the worker cooperative functions properly for the benefit of all, as a government inspector, as a partner in building something better, if you'll have me. And the word partner carried implications that made her heart race like a thoroughbred. Not rescue or charity, but genuine partnership between equals working towards shared goals that would benefit their entire community. Outside, she could hear Marshal Hayes giving orders to his deputies, organizing the investigation that would dismantle the syndicate's operations throughout California and beyond. The mill whistle would blow in a few hours, calling workers to jobs that were truly theirs for the first time in their working lives. "Caleb," she said quietly, "I don't know how to be anyone's partner. I only know how to survive whatever comes. That's exactly what makes you the right person for this responsibility." He reached for her hand, his palm warm and calloused from honest work. "You survived by being invisible, by paying attention when others weren't watching, by caring about details that powerful men ignored." His thumb traced across her knuckles in a gesture that spoke of tenderness rather than possession or control. Those are the same skills that will make you an exceptional mill manager and an exceptional partner in life. Dawn light was growing stronger outside the window, illuminating the lumberyard where her new life would begin. No more auctions, no more hiding in shadows, no more accepting invisibility as the price of mere survival. "All right," she said, and her voice carried a strength that surprised them both. "Let's build something better than what we're replacing." As Caleb's hand tightened around hers, Mara understood that the most profound changes really did begin with simple acts of human kindness. Saving an injured stranger had led to exposing corruption, protecting her community, and discovering her own worth in God's eyes. But more than that, it had led to this moment, sitting in a humble shed as dawn broke over the California mountains, holding hands with a man who saw her as an equal, planning a future built on honest work and mutual respect. The mill whistle would blow soon, calling workers to jobs that belonged to them by right. And for the first time in her life, Mara would answer that call not as someone's property, but as their chosen leader. The transformation was complete. The invisible girl had become indispensable to her community's future, and Cedar Falls would never be the same. This story of Mara and Caleb emerged from reflecting on how ordinary courage can transform entire communities when folks choose to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. In our modern times, we sometimes forget that the most profound changes often begin with someone willing to act when no one else is watching, like a young woman choosing to help a stranger despite the danger to herself. Their tale reminds us that true strength doesn't come from dramatic gestures or grand speeches, but from quiet persistence and the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Mara's journey from invisibility to leadership speaks to anyone who has ever felt overlooked or undervalued, showing how circumstances don't define our worth, Our choices and character do. In small towns across America, we still find echoes of this spirit: neighbors helping neighbors during hard times. Workers standing together against unfair treatment. Communities choosing integrity over easy profit. The values that saved Cedar Falls remain as relevant today as they were in 1884. Transparency in leadership. Dignity for all honest workers. And the understanding that lasting prosperity must benefit everyone, not just those already wealthy. Perhaps most importantly, this story celebrates partnerships built on mutual respect rather than rescue, where both people contribute their unique strengths to create something neither could achieve alone. In a world that often feels divided by differences, such partnerships offer hope for building bridges across disagreements and creating communities where everyone has both voice and value in decision-making. Disclaimer: this work is inspired by classic American Western literature created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. This tale celebrates themes of community cooperation, honest labor, and peaceful resolution of conflicts while maintaining historical accuracy for the 1880s American frontier period.